Thousands of Chinese peer-to-peer lending companies went bankrupt. Millions of people lost their money. Some say it was due to misplaced trust in the authorities. A Chinese woman used harsh words to describe a popular Chinese writer, but months later, she was the one in need of help. Beijing officials attempted to attack Australia with an inflammatory doctored photo. Instead, the faked image rallied support for the country. Joshua Wong, Hong Kong's prominent pro-democracy activist, was jailed for more than a year over a pro-democratic rally last year. And Joe Biden is selecting his picks for his cabinet. But what's their stance towards communist China? We dive into what this could mean for Biden's China policy. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Over 10,000 peer-to-peer or P2P lending victims petitioned to the authorities in a city in northern China. Lending scams in China have involved thousands of companies and around 50 million victims.
On Tuesday, over 10,000 peer-to-peer or P2P online lending scam victims appealed at the Petition Bureau in the North Chinese city of Dalian. They pursued over 30 Dalian-based P2P lending companies and accused the authorities of protecting the companies. In front of the Petition Bureau, they demanded to see the mayor. They asked for protections of these companies to be removed. They also complained that the investigation department of the government doesn't act. But the authorities ignored their requests. Many people had invested due to promises of double-digit returns and government backing of the business. Then they saw their life savings wiped out. Some of them sought to appeal their cases. One victim's family member, Mr. Wong, said they invested money because they believed in the government, but the government supervision was not effective and the company was allowed to take the money away. He said there are around 60,000 victims relating to Zhongpu Company, and the amount involved was over $1 billion in total. He said it was under government supervision, but the money has not been returned to the victims for 3 years.
Because of the support from the local government, a business license was issued. All the promotional ads had printed photos of the city leaders. The leaders appeared at their opening ceremony and cut the ribbon. This did not only happen in Dalian, but throughout the country. The companies have the local government's backing and are protected by officials. Now, even if they have money, they don't return it to us.
The victim, Mr. Lu, said the police were helping to protect the companies and suppressing the petitioners through forceful means.
In this financial disaster, some victims lost hope and committed suicide. Many people have put all their money into it and now they can't live anymore. We, the victims from all over the country, have been petitioning, making complaints, but the police are protecting the fraudsters and monitoring us victims under the guise of maintaining social stability. I was called to the local police station twice. They rebuked me as if I was a criminal.
The first P2P online lending company in China was established in 2007. As of the end of 2015, the cumulative transaction volume of online lending exceeded $1,000 billion, involving about 50 million investors. In 2018, a large number of the companies went bankrupt. Last month, the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission said thousands of P2P lending companies have been cleared. Only a few survived. Tens of thousands of financial victims have no way to defend their rights. Reporting by Xiongbing, NTD News.
A woman called Fairy Flavored Fruit on Weibo is known for her vicious verbal abuse towards a Chinese writer. But 6 months later, when the woman got kicked out by her landlord, she realized that nobody is out there to help the vulnerable.
On Weibo, one woman attacked a Chinese writer with the most vicious language, simply because the writer wrote about the pandemic in Wuhan this spring. Recently, the Danke Apartments crisis drove the woman to the streets in the cold winter. Danke Apartments this year became the second Chinese long-stay apartment company listed in the U.S. The name can be literally translated into eggshell apartments. Due to a broken financial chain, the company collected rental payments from tenants but was unable to pay the landlords. Thus, many tenants were kicked out by their landlords, and the woman is one of the victims. Her Weibo username can be translated as Fairy Flavored Fruit. We call her F3 in short. It was this young fairy-flavored woman that claimed publicly she would cut off Chinese writer Fang Fang's tongue. Fang Fang is a writer in Wuhan and posted her diaries of depictions and reflections on the pandemic from the epicenter. This was precious information for many during the government cover-up and the city lockdown, and her posts gained enormous amounts of shares and likes. Fang Fang's diary opened a window for many Chinese during that difficult time. But F3 insulted Fang Fang, calling her a lackey and a running dog for her doctor friends. She says Fang Fang was deliberately exaggerating and did that for money. She posted, quote, "This is to get some money to buy good quality coffins for your family, right? Fang Fang's tongue should be cut out and she should be taught to speak the truth. She should be sent to the United States. After all, it's the free country. Disgusting." But half a year later, on the same online account, F3 posted a request for help. She yelled, "Can the Danke company really get away with it?" and added, "Nobody is here to protect the vulnerable." She posted 2 photos showing her belongings packed up, ready to move, and hashtagged the company's name. Most netizens say her suffering is retribution for what she did to Fang Fang, and that the perpetrator became the victim. Reporting by Xu Wenhui, NTD News.
China posted a falsified photo hoping to ignite anger towards Australia. But China is the one left out in the cold as 5 countries are standing with Australia. This includes the United States. And now to NTD's Dawn Ma for the details.
A new low, even for the Chinese Communist Party, says U.S. State Department's deputy spokesperson while standing behind Australia in support. This is in response to China's post on Twitter of an inflammatory doctored photo against Australia. The Photoshop picture shows an Australian soldier preparing to kill an Afghan child. The post is a reaction to emerging evidence that Australian soldiers killed civilians in a war in Afghanistan. The spokesperson, Cale Brown, posted on his official U.S. government Twitter account condemning the CCP. He said, as the CCP spreads disinformation, it covers up its horrendous human rights abuses, including the detention of more than 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio also showed support. He wrote to Twitter's chief executive Jack Dorsey, showing discontent with the decision to keep the photo on Twitter. He also sounded concerned that Twitter is allowing enemies of America to release dangerously misleading images with no consequence. U.S.'s backing comes among numerous others, after New Zealand and France, the latest being Taiwan and the UK. Taiwan posted a photo of Australian wine to show its support, a reaction to China's recent high wine tariffs against Australia. Britain's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab proclaimed that the UK is also standing shoulder to shoulder with Australia. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison took to Chinese social media platform WeChat on Tuesday to criticize the false image. The message was censored by the CCP the next day. A notice appeared saying the content violated regulations. Chinese ambassador to Australia argues that Australia has misinterpreted and is overreacting to the post. Australia's acting immigration minister also responded to the doctored photo. It marks one of the first instances where Australia distinguished the CCP from Australian Chinese people. He stated that the Chinese Communist Party's views are their own and doesn't represent Chinese Australians. In addition, the US is also backing Australia militarily. Australian Defense Minister Linda Reynolds announced on Tuesday that the 2 countries will jointly develop hypersonic missiles. The weapons can travel more than 5 times the speed of sound, making them difficult to intercept once fired. The bilateral project comes as China has similar weapons in development.
It seems our viewers are showing support for Australia as well. Yesterday, some said they are going to buy Aussie wine for the holidays. Joshua Wong, one of Hong Kong's most prominent democracy activists, was jailed on Wednesday for more than 13 months over an anti-government rally in 2019. The toughest and most high-profile sentence for an opposition figure this year.
Prominent Hong Kong pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong was sentenced to over a year in jail on Wednesday after pleading guilty to organising and inciting an unlawful protest last year. The sentencing comes as government critics say Beijing is intensifying its crackdown on Hong Kong's opposition and wide-ranging freedoms, guaranteed by the 1997 handover of the former British colony. Authorities in China and Hong Kong reject that assessment. The protest in question, near Hong Kong's police headquarters last June, came when the city's sometimes violent pro-democracy rallies were already in full swing. Wong's longtime colleagues Agnes Chow and Ivan Lam were sentenced to 10 and 7 months respectively on charges linked to the same siege. Wong first rose to prominence during the city's pro-democracy umbrella movement in 2014, and his continued activism has drawn the wrath of Beijing. Wong disbanded his pro-democracy group Democesto just hours after China's parliament passed a sweeping national security law for Hong Kong this summer. Under the new law, any activity Beijing considers subversion, secession, terrorism, or collusion could be punished by up to life in prison.
Cooperative competition is possible between China and the U.S. That's the argument laid out by a Chinese Communist official in the New York Times opinion section. In a piece explaining why they published the article, the outlet states that so far this op-ed is the only official statement that has come from the government about the election of Joe Biden to the presidency. There is no denying that U.S.-China relations have been damaged over the past 4 years. The Chinese official is setting out the terms under which her government plans to work with a new Biden administration. This after nearly 4 years of President Trump's harsh policies punishing China's trade abuses, intellectual property theft, and human rights violations. But the Chinese regime seems more optimistic now, as media outlets are calling Democratic candidate Joe Biden as winning the election, despite ongoing lawsuits challenging the election results and allegations of voter fraud. Biden has already picked his cabinet members. NTD will not call the race until all legal disputes are resolved. Biden may or may not become the next U.S. president. But his potential cabinet members' past actions and relationships with Communist China hint at what Biden's China policy could look like. Jack Sullivan is Biden's pick for the National Security Advisor. He is a former senior official from Hillary Clinton's State Department. During a June 2017 speech he gave at the Lowy Institute, Sullivan said the U.S. should encourage China's rise economically. Sullivan called the containment of China a self-defeating policy.
Everything we can to both facilitate and encourage China's economic rise and to support it, because a thriving China is good for Europe, it's good for the United States.
And then more recently, in May of this year, Sullivan wrote in a foreign policy article he co-authored that there is greater nuance in the U.S.-China relationship that combines increasingly sharp competition with a still significant interdependence. This despite the U.S. having suffered from its dependence on China's drugs and personal protective equipment during the pandemic. Some earlier news about Sullivan was also particularly concerning for Taiwan. Beijing claims democratic Taiwan as its own territory and has never given up the idea of taking it over by force. According to a personal email of Hillary Clinton's leaked by WikiLeaks, Sullivan once shared an article to the then U.S. Secretary of State titled "To Save Our Economy, Ditch Taiwan." The email was sent with the title "Interesting Article." Hillary replied, saying she saw it and thought it was so clever, adding, "Let's discuss." 4 years ago, the Trump administration broke precedents by accepting a direct phone call from Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, who congratulated Trump on winning the election. This year, Biden has called leaders of all major allies, but has not spoken to Taiwan. Sullivan co-authored an article last October with another potential pick for Biden's cabinet, Kirk Campbell. The article, titled "Competition Without Catastrophe: How America Can Both Challenge and Coexist with China," argued that on Taiwan, a tacit commitment not to unilaterally alter the status quo is perhaps the best that can be hoped for, given the historical complexities. Whereas Pompeo this year announced that Taiwan is not part of China, regardless of Beijing's anger. The other author of the article, Kirk Campbell, served under Obama's State Department until 2013. After leaving office, he co-founded the consultant company, the Asia Group, which offers business advice for companies who want to enter the Asian market. In an article Campbell wrote in August, he warned against treating China as the Soviet Union. He argued that the right way forward will meld elements of a sustained commercial competition and military vigilance with necessary political dialogue and cooperation on global challenges. In other words, what Washington should seek to achieve is a clear-eyed coexistence with Beijing in the military, economic, political, and global governance domains that recognizes a competitive relationship need not be an adversarial one. Both Campbell and Sullivan acknowledged the failure of the past engagement policy with China. Nonetheless, their attitude still reflects a softer stance compared to Washington officials who support a tougher line against China. Congressional Republicans published their China report this September, recommending that the Trump administration clearly and publicly state an intention to break the CCP's totalitarianism. America's goal must not be indefinite coexistence with a hostile communist state, but rather the end of the party's monopoly on power, noting that all policies should flow from this North Star. Biden's pick for the Secretary of State is Tony Blinken. He, too, served under Obama's State Department. A scholar from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute wrote that Blinken seems to have developed a stronger appetite for competition than other Obama-era figures, but wants to work with Beijing to ensure that these competitive dynamics don't escalate into confrontation. Blinken said back in September that it's unrealistic for the U.S. to fully decouple from China, calling it ultimately counterproductive, and saying it would be a mistake. He added that right now, by every key metric, China's strategic position is stronger and America's strategic position is weaker. He said the U.S. should counter China by joining the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, a trade pact with Asian countries, and one that Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping said China is considering joining. Another Biden cabinet candidate that has shown some Asian countries concerned is Susan Rice. A former Singapore diplomat who was deemed a mouthpiece for the Singaporean foreign policy establishment wrote earlier this year that Susan Rice would be a disaster. She has very little interest in Asia, no stomach for competition, and thinks of foreign policy as humanitarian intervention. The former official added that Rice was among those who thought that the U.S. should de-emphasize competition to get China's cooperation on climate change, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of international relations. Also asserted that the U.S. will look back on Trump with nostalgia. Biden's nomination for the Department of Homeland Security is Alejandro Mayorkas.
Or look at the DHS nominee, Alejandro Mayorkas. He was found by Barack Obama's Inspector General to be guilty of selling green cards to Chinese nationals on behalf of rich Democratic donors. Think about that. Selling citizenship to well-connected Chinese nationals on behalf of Democratic Party donors. That is disqualifying to lead the Department of Homeland.
One of the Chinese nationals seeking a visa is the vice president of Huawei, a Chinese tech giant that helps Iran evade U.S. sanctions and develops technologies used by the regime to persecute ethnic minorities. The visa was a favor in return for Huawei's investment in a company whose CEO was Hillary Clinton's brother, Tony Clinton. Most of Biden's picks are Obama-era officials. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute wrote for countries in the Indo-Pacific that are living under the shadow of an increasingly aggressive Beijing, reviving the Obama administration's overly cautious approach would be a bad outcome. It continued that America can't just lead by the power of its example. It also needs to lead by the example of its power. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden released the names of his transition review team in early November. Several of his State Department picks are documented consultants to the Chinese Communist Party.
Joe Biden's transition review team includes several lobbyists and consultants from Albright Stonebridge Group, or ASG. The consulting firm has links to the Chinese regime and employs former Chinese officials. 3 of Biden's State Department transition review team come from ASG, including team leader Linda Thomas Greenfield. Her profile said she led the firm's Africa practice. It was taken down sometime after Biden named her part of his team. Biden also picked her to be U.S. ambassador to the UN. During the Obama administration, she was the top diplomat overseeing African affairs. President Trump fired her shortly after he took office. 2 other ASG members on Biden's State Department team are Sumona Guha and Roberta Jacobson. And Biden chose ASG member Elizabeth Littlefield to lead his International Development Transition Team. The group includes the U.S. Agency for International Development and the related Finance Corporation. ASG is Madeleine Albright's consulting firm. She was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, and she currently chairs the company. According to ASG's website, the firm's largest single country practice is in China. One of ASG's China team leaders is Jin Ligang. He's a Chinese Communist Party member and former senior Chinese government official. Other ASG members who have worked for the Chinese regime include Dai Yunlo, Jia Mingru, Mulan, and Harry Hu. The National Pulse first reported the news that Biden tapped ASG members for his transition review team.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.